59, only 8 members of the Council of Ministers are below 50 years old, and there is a comparatively speaking high percentage of women in the Council of Ministers, over 25%. The leaderships, the political leadership in Cuban provinces is 40 years old as an average, and this is basically the level, the power structure in which we can find the younger and the high percentage of women, which is 37.5%. Well, I ran out of time already. I just wanted to add that the list of problems, the list of policies, and the characteristics of the leaderships are exactly mirroring the transition. It's a typical transition situation. And I want to finish by stressing the importance of what, to me, is the main goal of the Cuban government policies today, and the main goal of the updating socialism strategy, which is the recreation, the strengthening and the achievement of a new institutional system. To say, the question of the institutionalize the system, re-institutionalize the system, and make the system work institutionally is, to me, a key question from the viewpoint of the political agenda. Thank you very much.
Yeah? Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the University of California at Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, Center for Latino Policy Research, Center for Latin American Studies, for the invitation to participate in this important conference on Cuba and California. My special appreciation to Christine Trust for her effort to coordinate the conference under very difficult circumstances. Also to my good longtime friend Julia Swake, with whom I am sharing the podium. The organizers have asked me to give an overview of US-Cuba relations and recent reforms both in Cuba and the US, and comment on the likely implications of these reforms for shaping this binational relationship. Perhaps nothing illustrates more the paradoxical and dysfunctional nature of the present relationship between both our countries than the fact that you are watching this video and will watch another video with my friend Rafael Hernández. For the second time in the last 5 months, the State Department has deemed inopportune that we visit the US and do what we like to do best, build bridges between our two countries, so that the moment when we will have normal relations comes closer. Therefore, they have either denied or not responded to our visa requests. It does not seem to matter that we received 2 visas in 2001. In my case, to go to New York, one to attend a seminar on Cuba at the Billner Center, the other as a visiting professor at Queens College, both part of CUNY. My friends and colleagues, Soraya Castro and Rafael Hernández, are in the same situation. After academic visits to the US in 2011, they have been denied visas for the same purpose in 2012. Is it because campaign politics in the United States interfere with what otherwise be a mutually beneficial exchange of ideas? Or are we facing the same kind of situation that we faced between 2003 and 2009, when the Bush administration practically stopped all kinds of academic, cultural, scientific, and societal exchanges between Cuba and the United States. As the Washington Post put it in May, when the State Department denied visas to 10 Cuban scholars, the three of us among them who applied to attend the Latin American Studies Association Congress in San Francisco, and I quote, "The rejection sends a message that a timorous Washington is somehow afraid of competing points of view from academics in a poor island nation with a shrinking population and an economy about the size of Arkansas. It's a message that conveys weakness, not strength." End of quotation. You draw your own conclusions. There are many numbers of reasons why I would like normalization to happen, but one of them is very personal and very important. I have a daughter who emigrated to this country, lives and teaches in New York, and became a U.S. citizen last year. Her two sons, my grandsons, one of them studying at Cornell, will soon become citizens in their own right. My daughter should have been here today sharing with us from her unusual perspective. A Cuban girl born in 1967, studied in the Soviet Union, married first a Russian and later an American, and moved to the U.S. in 2005 after living for 9 years in Portugal. This fact to me illustrates the point that there is no way that our societies can be separated. We are neighbors and have so much in common. But then again, we are asymmetrical. The U.S. is the greatest superpower in the history of the world. Cuba is a small island nation with very meager economic resources that cannot do or intends to do any harm to the United States or its citizens. If this close asymmetric relationship is going to change, certain historical mistakes have to be recognized and dealt with. In April this year, when President Obama met Latin American and Caribbean presidents and prime ministers at the Cartagena Summit of the Americas, they unanimously told him that Cuba must be invited to the next summit in Panama in 2015, or the meeting will be in jeopardy. The American head of state complained to journalists in bewilderment that the Latin American and Caribbean demands referred to events that took place long before he had been born, during the Cold War, and that he was not responsible for them. If you look at Cuban-U.S. relations from a young Cuban's perspective in 2012, that is exactly how he or she might feel and say. But President Obama, but for failing on his promise of a new beginning with Cuba in April 2009, has become the owner of a failed policy. There are no normal diplomatic relations since January 3rd, 1961, because President Eisenhower made the decision to sever them just a few months before the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, carried out by the Kennedy government, but designed, planned, and made operational by the CIA under a Republican administration designated by political scientists as the hidden hand presidency. There are no economic, financial, or trade relations since February 1962, when President Kennedy, a few months before the missile crisis, decreed sanctions through a presidential order that took as its premise the Trading with the Enemy Act, even though Cuba and the United States were not and are not in what international law scholars and U.S. legislation call a state of war. Last year, Rafael and I were at the United Nations General Assembly when a Cuban-sponsored resolution reproving the U.S. blockade of Cuba was adopted by a majority of 187 to 2. It was the 21st time the General Assembly passes that resolution. Delegation after delegation, including the most important U.S. allies, pointed out the illegality of the so-called embargo and demanded its lifting. Cuba is in the list of states who sponsor terrorism since 1982, placed there by the Reagan administration after Cuba accepted a Colombian government request that it help solve a diplomatic hostage case by accepting the kidnappers and their captives in Havana. Today, Cuba is still on the list. One of the arguments used by the State Department to keep it there is that Havana still hosts members of the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, FARC. designated by the State Department as a terrorist organization. The Colombian government of President Santos has recently started negotiations with FARC, peace negotiations with FARC, and recognized the positive roles played by the governments of Norway and Cuba in bringing about the conversations. In fact, both countries have been designated by the negotiating partners as guarantors of the peace agreements when they are attained. These examples demonstrate two things. The first one, that the present state of Cuban-US relations is basically defined by events that happened during the Cold War and has nothing to do with the present world. The response to this situation can be best illustrated by something said by none other than Ron Paul during the debate between him, Mitt Romney, Rick Santorum, and Newt Gingrich previous to the Florida Republican primary back in January. Guys, the Cold War is over. Let's normalize and trade with Cuba. The second one is that most of what defines the relationship has been the product of US decisions taken on the basis of dubious legitimacy, morality, legality, or criteria of efficacy. A clear example of this last point, efficacy, is what has happened in the diplomatic front of this conflict. In the early 60s, the US not only severed diplomatic relations with Cuba, but tried to isolate its government, especially from Latin America and the Caribbean. By 1964, it had apparently succeeded. All hemispheric partners, except Canada and Mexico, broke off relations with Cuba. But things started to change in the 1970s. Today, all Latin American and Caribbean governments have normal diplomatic relations with Havana, invite Cuba to participate in all its summits, and it insists in Raul Castro's presence in conferences with other regions. Cuba participates in the Rio Group, is going to be the venue of the third summit of the newly formed Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, and joins the summits with the European Union and with Spain and Portugal in the Ibero-American negotiating process. Cuban containment has not worked. In an additional fact, as we stand today, 1 million Canadians come to Cuba every year, turning that country into the first origin of all tourism coming to the island. Ottawa has become the second foreign investor and is Cuba's fourth trading partner. The same month that the United States refused to accept the Cuban presence at the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, Colombia, in April this year, Havana was visited by Pope Benedict XVI, the President of Mexico, and the President of Vietnam. Who or what is isolated? Cuba or US policy of non-recognition of the legitimacy of the Cuban government? What is the position of the Cuban government on the issue? It is positioned to negotiate with the United States all outstanding issues and talk with the United States on all subjects that Washington wants to talk to Havana: human rights, democracy, political prisoners. As simple as that, no preconditions. And in this, they have the support of the majority of the Cuban people. The adversaries of the present policy use any number of arguments to stop engagement between the Cuban and US governments. Their preferred one is the terrorist state argument. You do not negotiate with terrorists, they say. And Cuba is a state that sponsors terrorism according to the State Department, even though there is no shred of evidence to prove it. If you want to check that out, go to the webpage of the Department of State and download the report on states that sponsor terrorism. If Cuba had a list of states that sponsor terrorism, it would have much more evidence to put the United States in it, including the fact that Luis Posada Carriles, better known as the Latin American Bin Laden, the person who has committed and confessed carrying out terrorist attacks against Cuba, even inside Cuban territory, lives freely in Miami, where he's the object of tribute by the right-wing Cuban-American organizations and even some institutions like the University of Miami. The refusal to treat Cuba as any other government can be negative for US interests. When Cuba decided to offer to foreign oil companies the possibilities of exploring for oil and gas